The Chinese Communist Party has introduced new guidelines on ideological and political work. The changes affect both party members and citizens. These new requirements add to China's already strict guidelines around academic and press freedoms. Meanwhile, a China expert says the Chinese Communist Party's new loyalty push exposes leader Xi Jinping's insecurities. Well, joining us now to tell us more on this is Mr. Craig Singleton, Adjunct Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks, Nima.
So can you tell us about the CCP's new set of guidelines that were recently introduced?
Absolutely. So within days of Xi Jinping's fiery July 1st speech marking the Chinese Communist Party's centennial, the party issued new guidelines regarding its ideological and political work, and one that targets not only CCP members, but all of Chinese society. And the goal of these new guidelines is relatively simple and straightforward: ensure absolute loyalty to Xi and to the party. And that includes enhancing the Chinese public's sense of political, ideological, theoretical, and emotional identification with what is often referred to as Xi thought, or the political doctrine that Xi enshrined into the Chinese Communist Party constitution.
And how do these guidelines differ from the other rules introduced by Xi Jinping's government, such as the national security law in 2020?
These new guidelines go even farther than the party's previous indoctrination efforts. Since assuming office in 2012, Xi has waged an intensely ideological campaign aimed at stifling academic and press freedom, all the while orientating China around an aggressive form of nationalism. These efforts also included neutralizing any and all forms of dissent. And yet these latest guidelines make clear that Xi and the party remain deeply concerned about the durability of the party's ideological dominion over the country.
Now, this month was the CCP's 100th anniversary. We saw President Xi boasting about his party's work in bringing up China's economic recovery. So how can all of this speak towards the party's insecurities, as you mentioned in your recent column?
So to remain in power, Xi and the party must deliver on their promise of high-quality growth and shared prosperity, all the while taking into account that the drivers of the last decade's growth are quickly running out of steam. To make matters worse, the United States and other countries around the world have begun to more aggressively confront China's non-market practices, including rampant intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer for companies that are operating inside China. Such practices sit at the heart of China's economic growth. Thus far, Xi has not fully explained how he intends to maintain China's economic growth in the face of all of these new threats. And it's that uncertainty that's going to place a lot of pressure on the Chinese Communist Party in years to come.
So can you paint us a picture on how these new guidelines can impact Chinese citizens as the party continues to try to maintain control within the country?
It remains to be seen how these specific new guidelines are going to play out over the long term. That said, it's clear that the party is willing to pull out all the stops in preparation for next year's 20th Party Congress. And that's when Xi will, in theory, assume a once unprecedented third term. And so in the interim, I suspect the Chinese government will have little tolerance for any internal dissent, whether it be on the ground or on Chinese social media.
Now, we've got a little over 2 minutes left, sir, but considering the CCP government's efforts to maintain control and grow control within China, can all of this be comparable to the operations inside North Korea, considering that these two countries are also close allies?
There are some similarities in terms of ideology and indoctrination, although both countries are really quite different from one another. What is relevant, I think, is that in both cases, policymakers here in the United States and Canada and other countries are ultimately attempting to influence a decider of one, and that's either Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un.
All right, sir, just about a minute left, but what kind of steps should world leaders take to respond to these new guidelines and alleged human rights abuses within China?
Increased international attention on China's human rights abuses in recent months has definitely caught Beijing's attention. A few months ago, for example, Xi issued new guidance intended to soften Beijing's image, in essence, reining in some of the wolf warrior diplomacy. Those directives did not, however, involve changes to Chinese policies, simply how they are communicated and framed to international observers. That said, I suspect we're unlikely to see any major willingness on the part of the Chinese Communist Party or Xi to discuss human rights in the coming months. What the US and other countries really need to do is stay focused on avoiding miscalculation and really deciding if, when, and how they're going to respond to Chinese provocation.